So welcome to our webinar. Today we'll be discussing how healthcare payers can overcome the explosion of consumer-related data using a simple cloud-based approach that can be rapidly injected into their business processes. And so now I'd like to introduce our speaker, John Case. John is a senior solutions architect here at Verado. He has decades of experience in information management and master data management, spanning roles in implementation services, pre-sales support, solution architecture, and product management. He has consulted and delivered solutions for clients across many industries with particular focus on healthcare, insurance, and financial services, from Fortune 500 companies to community-sized hospitals. And with that, I will hand this over to John. John, if you don't mind.
Thank you very much, Rachel. As Rachel mentioned, my name is John Case. Good afternoon to everyone, or I guess good morning for anyone who's dialing in from Pacific time. So let's get right into it. We've got a little under 45 minutes here, so I want to make sure we leave some time for questions at the end. So today we're really going to talk about the ways in which Verado's technology and solutions are applicable to health insurance payers. And in particular, we're going to talk about really the data landscape that that's common amongst health insurance organizations. And so what was common maybe a decade ago, maybe even more recently than a decade, was fairly homogeneous data. Health insurance organizations received a lot of data about their consumers, but it was really membership data, and it was primarily coming from employers. There would be some individual coverage, but it was primarily from employers. Whereas today, it's a very different landscape. There's a much wider variety of information that's really being used and leveraged by health insurance organizations. Some of it's still membership data, but it can be clinical data, survey data, applicants who apply for coverage but abandon a cart or get denied for coverage. And it's not just coming from employers, it's coming directly from the consumers, it's coming from providers, HIEs, and the degree of quality and completeness of the data is much more varied than it used to be. And this presents challenges that we'll talk about throughout the course of the webinar. So how have organizations dealt with this? So a decade ago or more, or even more recently, the typical tools that were used for dealing with this kind of data tended to be things like data quality tools that may have been built into data integration platforms. A lot of organizations started adopting master data management technologies, whether it was called MDM or something else. There were similar technologies. And the goal was to get a single enterprise-wide view really of the member. We say consumer, but primarily this was membership-centric information. So today those same technologies are typically being used against a wider variety of data, but it results in a more difficult ability to piece together that single view of the consumer, particularly when those data sources are more thin. And so you end up with these fragmented views and incomplete views of a consumer. And that's going to impact you in a lot of ways. When you have fragmented, incomplete views, you're unable to accomplish the types of things that you want to be able to accomplish with that single view. Things like processing claims as efficiently as possible, properly assessing risk, coordinating for benefits with other organizations, facilitating reporting, and just in general consumer-centric strategies. And so those are all ideal things that everyone wants to accomplish with this single comprehensive view of a consumer. But the more fragmented those views are, the more challenging it becomes to actually accomplish those things. And again, as I mentioned, that feature is really because of the explosion in the variety of the data that's coming in and the discrepancy in how complete, how accurate, and how correct that information is. So those technologies I talked about that people use for piecing together this single view of a member or a consumer, they all work off of demographic information, things like names and birth dates, addresses, social security numbers if you have them. And so obviously the more similar those pieces of information are, the better you can accurately identify that you've got the same person. So if I have two different pictures of a member, John Smith, and the name and the birth date and the address are all the same or pretty similar, then those existing technologies are really good at lining that information up. And because 10 years ago most of that information was pretty homogeneous, those technologies did a decent job of doing that. Now the challenge comes today because of the fact that you're getting a wider variety of information from a wider variety of sources, and you've got a lot more errors in the information. So in our experience, at least 30% of demographic information is out of date, incorrect, or incomplete. Sometimes it's a lot higher than that, but at least 30%. And this is backed up by other studies throughout the healthcare industry. And there's a lot of reasons that this can happen. I mean, one of them is that things just change over time naturally. So if I'm looking at a person and I'm tracking their name and their address and so on, people's names change when they get married and divorced. People move. Something like almost 15% of the population moves every year. So it happens pretty frequently. Then there's other types of errors. There could be outright errors where you mistype a birth date, spelling errors, transcription errors, and there's just ambiguities. There are ambiguities with names. Sometimes someone's name is Junior. Sometimes they tell you their name is Junior. Sometimes they don't. Different cultures have different representations of names. So a lot of Asian cultures will reverse what we think of as first and last name, and so you can end up with those names transposed, and it's not necessarily an error, it's just a discrepancy in the data. And then incompleteness is a big problem. So you may have sort of a picture of what you're trying to model for a consumer, but you may have holes in it, and it may be outright missing information, like you could be missing the email for a person. Or it could be that you just have default information. You have a social security number of all nines or all ones. It's basically as bad as missing information. Sometimes it's worse than missing information if you don't treat it as though it's a missing information. And so for all of these reasons, you can end up with a lot of shortcomings in the correctness and the completeness of the data that you're working with. And that really exacerbates the problem that we were talking about, the ability to accurately tie all your information together to do these consumer-centric initiatives. So when you start changing this information and you start having typos in names and mistyped birth dates and missing information, the ability to take two different records about Joe Smith and Joseph Smith and actually line them up and decide if they're the same person, it becomes really hampered. Maybe an extreme example is you've got Mary Smith and Mary Jones, and Mary Smith lives in Chicago and Mary Jones lives in Detroit. Those don't really sound like the same person. But it could be that Mary Smith got married and changed her name to Mary Jones and moved to Detroit. And maybe they are the same person, but there's no way to tell based on that information. So what Verado does is really a very different approach to linking and matching consumer-related data. And this approach has proven very effective for customers, particularly in healthcare, including health insurance. And what Verado does is we don't just look at the data that is given to us by our clients. We actually build up our own reference database, which is a self-learning database of identities in the United States. And we use this to be able to match consumer-related data, link data together from our customer's data source, and even validate and enrich our customer's data. And this database that we use, we refer to it as carbon, as in carbon-based life forms, all the people in the United States. It's a very extensive and complete database. And most importantly, it's really self-correcting and self-learning. Each new piece of information we get allows us to improve and correct the database. And the reference database, what makes it very complete and authoritative are the sources from which we draw upon our reference data. So we build up our carbon reference database using data sources like credit header information, utility and telephone information, government and court proceeding documents, voter registration, DMV type things. These are all sources of data where the quality of the information is fairly high. The people who are providing the information, the citizen, the credit consumer, et cetera, they're providing information in a way where it's in their best interest to provide the correct information. And so we intentionally use those types of data sources to build up our carbon database to make it as correct and authoritative as possible. An alternative is more marketing-centric databases that get built up by other companies. And because they're focused on marketing use cases and they don't want restrictions associated with the data, they'll go out and buy magazine subscription lists and sweepstake lists and things like that. And those are not very authoritative sources of information because they tend to be sources of information where people give the wrong information. If I'm signing up for a sweepstakes, I'm not incented to give you my correct phone number necessarily. Whereas if I'm signing up for a mortgage, I certainly am. Now, if you take that carbon database and apply it to the problem that we just talked about, being able to identify when I'm dealing with the same person identity, we do that not by comparing those person identities against each other, but by comparing them against our carbon reference database. So in this example, I'll go back to the Mary Smith and Mary Jones example. Mary Smith and Mary Jones, one lives in Chicago, one lives in Detroit. Because we know inside of the carbon database that Mary Smith did change her name to Mary Jones, and we know the addresses she lived at, we can take those two records and line them up to the same unique person in carbon and know definitively that those are in fact the same person. So the Mary Smith who had membership coverage 2 years ago and the Mary Jones who's on a Medicare Advantage plan are in fact the same person, and that can be very valuable to your organization because you may not have realized that piece of information. The other thing that's very useful with this carbon reference database is the ability to deal with thinner information. So one of the scenarios that you might have is where you're trying to take your own membership data, which might be relatively rich, and you're trying to marry it up with information maybe from lab results or provided by a provider or even more marketing type of information. And you might have a relatively small number of attributes that overlap. So I may have a rich member record on one side of the picture, but on the other side of the picture, I only have a name and a birth date for someone. So I really only have two pieces of information that I can use to try to decide, is record A the same as record B? And so those pieces of information may even match perfectly, but your traditional technology, MDM or data quality type technologies, are going to be tuned in such a way that to be able to declare that the same person. Two Mary Jones records, both born on February 16th, that may look like a good match, but it's not enough information to go on to say this is definitely the same person, because there might be more than one Mary Jones out there in the world who was born on February 16th. So that's another one of the advantages of the referential matching approach from Verado, is that we can take that same piece of information and we can go and line it up in carbon and say, yes, we know within our carbon database who this person is, but more importantly, we know that this does not match any other person in carbon. There isn't actually a Mary Jones born, isn't a second or third or fourth Mary Jones born on that birth date. We know that this is actually one unique person. So even with thin information, we can line the data up, not only line it up to carbon, to the correct reference in carbon, but be able to match your data sources against each other. And that can be very valuable, like I said, when you're trying to take more disparate data sources other than just membership data and line them up and really try to match them because there's downstream business processes that depend on that. So the Verado solution that I just described, it's a cloud-based solution. It's simple, it's secure, it's scalable, and because it's cloud-based, it's very fast to implement. We do customer implementations in weeks, whereas those other technologies take months, if not years. And it's very cost-effective. There's no hardware, there's no maintenance because it's a cloud-based solution. And the simplicity of it is really the fact that you can choose to plug this technology into as few or as many business processes as you really need to. So I know that we talked about master data management technology as something that a lot of organizations have adopted. One of the challenges of master data management is that you really have to get a pretty broad enterprise-wide consensus on what is your business case for deploying this technology, because it's really expensive and it's really time-consuming. And so you have to go out and convince yourself that you're going to apply this technology to 6 or 7 or 8 different use cases. And when in fact you maybe only apply it to 2 or 3, and it can be viewed as a failure in your organization. So part of the simplicity of a cloud-based solution is that you can choose to apply it to as few or as many business processes as you need to, because it is, it's an as-a-service solution, so it's very easy to plug in. Now I wanted to talk about the ways in which Verado's technology can be useful for health insurance payer organizations. I've talked more broadly about the fact that we use this reference database that we've curated, and we can use it to more accurately match and identify information, we can also use that reference database to validate and enrich information. And so I'm going to talk through some specific examples of how this can be used. So the first example I'll talk about is just something that's bread and butter for any health insurance or any insurance organization for that matter, which is processing claims. So every organization has a process for how they take incoming claims from n number of sources and match them up against the membership databases. And the way that those processes work is that you try to automate as much of it as you can, because that's more efficient, more cost friendly. But some of it ends up always being manual. Something ends up going wrong either in the data that's coming in on the claim or even the data in your own membership database, and it forces you to go off into a manual process. And often that's because of these data discrepancies that we talked about, little errors in the data or missing pieces of data. And it prevents you from definitively saying, yes, I know that the person on this claim is definitely member 123 in my membership database. And when you're unable to make that connection because of missing or bad data, then you end up in these manual processes that can get really expensive and really time consuming. And so Verado can be applied to improve that automation and decrease the amount of processing that gets routed manually. And this can happen in a couple different ways. One of the ways that Verado can decrease the number of claims that have to be processed manually is just our ability to be able to match and link together records that other technology can't. So I gave examples before of cases where we would match records that may not appear to be the same, but we realize they're the same because of our referential matching. So in those cases, it's very simple that if we can connect the dots between a claim and a member record in a way that your current technology cannot, then you stay on that automated path. Now there's another way that we also help with this process. Even if you're not using us to necessarily match and link together all of your records, you can still use Verado's cloud service as a validation technology on the actual data itself about a person. And that can help you with this process. So, if you imagine that the left-hand side of the picture is a claim for Joe Smith, and it says that his birth date is March 23rd. And on the right-hand side of the picture, you have all your various member records, and you, in fact, have Joe Smith as a member, and you know everything about him, and you know his birth date is March 28th. And for whatever reason within your processing, the fact that the claim says his birth date is March 23rd, and you say his birth date is March 28th, that might be the thing that sends you down this path of manual adjudication. So even without bringing Verado in to match together all the data, you can still take the identity data off of that claim and run it against Verado as a validation and say, Verado, do you know Joe Smith, born on March 23rd? He lives in Raleigh, North Carolina, and here's his phone number, etc. And Verado will come back with a validation saying, yes, I know Joe, and here's the information I know about him. And by the way, I think his birth date is March 28th, not March 23rd. And that validation and correction can be enough to let you deal with that claim in an automated fashion rather than a manual fashion, because now you realize that you've got the wrong birth date and you can proceed. Now, another scenario, which is somewhat similar, is really streamlining the enrollment process. So again, much like the claim scenario, you have, just like you have claims coming from lots of places, you have enrollment coming from more and more places, especially because it's not just an employer-centric world anymore. You have the insurance exchanges. A lot of organizations are opening retail centers, and there's a lot more direct business coming in. And of course, that stuff all ends up in membership databases. And at the time of enrollment, one of the things you want to make sure you understand is, do I know this person already? Do they have current coverage? Have they had previous coverage? Does that change what I know about them? Does that change the risk that I know about them? And you may have your own technologies for dealing with that, but again, Verado can optimize and improve that process. So just like I talked about before with this concept of validating a person's identity, you can come to Verado for that validation to say, does Verado know this person? Are they a real person? That might be useful to know. Is someone coming in and signing up for insurance under a completely fake name? But also, do they, not only do they exist, but is this someone that I've seen before? because they may be in the membership database, but they may have different demographic information than what's coming in on the new enrollment. And Verado is able to see through that and tell you that, yes, in fact, this is a person you've seen before. Maybe they currently have other coverage that's active through a spouse, or maybe they used to have previous coverage, and that piece of information may still be valuable to your enrollment process. Another example here is in the process of coordinating benefits with other organizations. So this could be going and looking for third-party liability where you're not sure if third-party liability exists, or it could be just coordinating benefits when you already know that someone else has coverage. So maybe someone filed a claim and it comes in through the provider's office, and they've outright told you, I have insurance through Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Carolina, but I'm also on my wife's plan through Care First. And so they've already told you. And so if you're one of those two organizations, you're going to have to coordinate with the other organization. Or it could be that someone filed a claim and said, I have insurance with Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Carolina, and they didn't tell you about their other insurance. But you still want to go out and check with other organizations to see if there's other liability out there. So you may use some service to do that. You may participate in something like CAQH for that. Regardless of what the scenario is, whether it's private insurance or coordinating with Medicare, you still have this fundamental problem of the success rate of finding that other insurance and doing that coordination depends on how closely your view of the member matches up with someone else's view of the member. So again, if you have Joe Smith born on March 23rd, and someone else thinks it's Joseph Smith born on March 28th with a different address than you've got, then chances are bad that you're going to be able to successfully coordinate that. You're going to talk to each other and say, I don't think we know that guy. And again, you can inject Verado in the middle of this process to be able to use our referential database to expand the number of attributes and pieces of information you're working with to ensure that you really do get the right match, so that you can say, hey, I'm going and coordinating with this other agency. There's multiple addresses that you might know Joe by. You might know him as Joe, you might know him as Joseph. His birthday might be March 28th. It increases the odds of successfully getting that connection between your organization and another organization. Again, whether that's going out and coordinating with other private insurance companies or even coordinating with Medicare for Medicare plans. The beauty of this, by the way, is that this does not depend on both of these organizations using Verado technology. Obviously, there's increased advantage if both organizations do use Verado technology, but even one of the organizations on either side of the picture here can use that validation process from Verado and the enrichment from Verado to be able to improve the outcome of the business process. Something else that we touched on earlier was the idea of reporting. The more accurate your single view of a consumer, the better your reporting is going to be. And I know that's a fairly broad statement, but I wanted to give a specific example here. So one of the types of reportings that you might be doing just for internal purposes or as part of external scorecards would be something like HEDIS reporting, where you're reporting on actual health quality. And these types of reportings like HEDIS reporting or quality scorecards, one of the factors in these reports is not just how satisfied are consumers with your service, but it's actual reporting of prevention and treatment. How often are you giving preventative care to your members? How often do members over the age of 50 get a colonoscopy? How often do people diagnosed with diabetes get a cholesterol screening? Those sorts of go into these types of reporting. And it sounds pretty straightforward, but to be able to do that reporting, you need to connect together your membership data with clinical data. And that clinical data may be coming from a number of providers, may be coming from lab organizations, some of it may be coming on claims, some of it may not. And so you've got a pretty diverse set of data sources that you need to be able to tie together to accurately do this reporting. And the more diverse those data sources get and the more thin the data sources get, the harder it becomes to correctly tie them together, even with some of the traditional technologies that have been used. If you have a lab report that's got a name and a phone number and a birth date, and you have a membership roster that has a name and an address and an SSN, you don't have a lot in common across those two data sources, and it can be really hard to say whether or not those two Joe Smiths are the same person based on that very little overlap in the data. Whereas Verado's referential approach can take both of those data sources, line them up to the correct person in our reference database, and definitively tell you that, yes, these are the same person. This lab record definitely goes with this member record. Now you've connected the dots in a way where you can accurately do reporting, whether it's HEDIS reporting or something else. Now there's another scenario that we haven't touched on. You know, we've talked about kind of big, important things in terms of a business, right? Fraud and claims efficiency and billing and things like that. But part of the consumer-centric change in the health insurance industry is also just being able to understand things like lifestyle and demographic and psychographic information about your consumers, so that you can do more targeted marketing, better analytics, better personalized service. These are maybe softer benefits that on the surface maybe don't sound as important as, HEDIS reporting or claims efficiency, but they can be massively important to health insurance organizations, particularly when a lot of these consumer-centric initiatives are really very top-down initiatives that are being mandated right from the board of directors. And so Verado has an ability to enrich information. So we've talked a lot about the core identifying information about consumers, their names, their addresses, their birth dates, things like that. Verado also can make connections to third-party data sources to allow you to enrich the information that you know. So we can use our referential matching to connect together your consumer data with other third-party enrichment data services to be able to help fill in the blanks on information like household income or employment status or lifestyle indicators, other type of psychographic information to help round out and improve that understanding of the consumer for some of these other consumer-centric initiatives. So with those examples in mind, I wanted to leave with a bit of a call to action. I know that some or all of the examples may resonate with the folks listening to the webinar here, but if you want to think about what are some next steps, how do I kind of take some of these concepts and contemplate how they're going to be useful to my organization. There's a couple things you can do to essentially put us to the test. We've worked a lot with healthcare organizations, both in the payer space as well as in the provider and HIE space and even the federal government. And there's a few different ways that people tend to put us to the test. So one of them is what we call a diagnostic report. You can basically diagnose the quality of the information that you have on your member data, your consumer data, whatever data sources you want to look at. And this diagnosis is really based on taking your data and we run it against our carbon reference data source to say, where do you have discrepancies between your data and what we have in our authoritative reference source? And we've done this for a number of customers. I mentioned earlier in the presentation the statistic that typically at least 30% of the information is incorrect or out of date or incomplete. We've worked with payer organizations where we've seen over 60% of the member records have some discrepancy in the demographic information. It can be really glaringly obvious things like missing social security numbers. You have no SSN for Joe Smith, and we know what the SSN for Joe Smith is. And it can be more minor things. It can be the fact that you thought his name was Joe Smith, but we can tell you that his name is actually Joseph Smith Sr. And while that may not sound as important as a missing SSN, it can end up being a pretty big factor in your ability to connect your own data together as well as connect your data to other organizations that you need to coordinate with. And then there's also pilot projects that we've done for a number of organizations where we move beyond that high-level diagnostic and we start applying either our matching or validation technology to more specific business processes within an organization. So an example of this with another payer we worked with was a study where we looked at Verado's validate capability and how that could plug into a Medicare coordination process. And we found that at a rate of over 90%, Verado was able to provide missing information from health claims and health membership records that were preventing an organization from accurately coordinating benefits with Medicare. So that's a pretty, massive finding for them, and it was very, very beneficial for them. And that was more an application of Verado's technology at a more targeted business process, whereas the diagnostic is really just looking from an overall quality perspective. So with that, I'm sure there's some questions out there. I didn't dive too deep into the guts of the technology. I wanted the focus of today to be more on sort of the bigger picture of what sort of things are going on in the data landscape for health insurance companies. How is that affecting companies? How are people dealing with it today? And introducing Verado as really a very new and different way of dealing with some of these age-old problems that haven't been tackled through other technologies. So Rachel, if you don't mind, I will check in with you to see where we're at in terms of some Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, John. We do have a couple of questions that came in. The first one is, what if I've already deployed an MDM solution? Can Verado help improve it, or is it just a standalone service?
Thanks. That's a very good question. So thanks to whoever asked that. So I did talk about master data management technology, and I probably talked about it more as a compare and contrast, right? MDM technology works one way, Verado works another, but the reality is that we can coexist and augment master data management solutions very well, and we often do, because most health insurance payer organizations have master data management technology. Most have more than one master data management technology, as a matter of fact. And so there's ways that we can, augment that MDM technology, and there's things that we do that are very different than MDM technology. So one of the simplest examples of augmenting master data management technology is by using Verado to essentially automate what's known as data stewardship tasks inside of a master data management solution. So MDM technologies do a number of things. One of them is just the process of trying to match together your records. Does Joe Smith equal Joseph Smith? Are these two records the same person? And some technology is able to connect those records together if the attributes are similar enough. And sometimes the MDM technology doesn't quite match things, and it actually creates what's known as a data stewardship queue, a queue of potential matches that are supposed to be looked at by a human. Joe Smith and Joseph Smith, one lives in Chicago, one lives in Detroit. I have a reason to think these might be the same person, but I'm not confident enough that they're the same person that I would automatically link them together. That's the sort of thought process that's baked into that master data management software. So it takes those records and puts it into essentially a queue for what's known as a data stewardship process. And the thought is that a human being will come through and look at this, maybe do some additional research, and decide, do I think Joe Smith and Joseph Smith are the same person or not? And that sounds good in theory, but in practice, very few MDM users actually take advantage of this data stewardship feature because it just becomes overwhelming. If you have millions and millions of membership records, and you have even just a couple 100,000 of these data stewardship tasks, which would be a low number, by the way, for a typical MDM project, the thought of trying to go through and manually look at hundreds of thousands of these is just overwhelming. So Verado can actually use our referential matching to take all of those potential match data stewardship jobs and run them through our carbon referential matching and give you an answer automatically. So instead of a human having to look at it, we can go through and give you an answer. And a lot of those tricky matches that MDM technologies don't quite get are the ones that we're really good at. They're the ones where someone has had a name change and a move, or someone has mistyped a birth date in SSN, or someone has tried to connect together records that are really thin. They're missing, one's missing an SSN, one's missing a birth date. You just can't decide. And we're really good at resolving those and giving you the definitive answer to automate that. So that's an example of where we can augment and improve the existing MDM deployment. There are also examples where Verado can be applied to things that MDM just can't really do, and it's not a shortcoming of MDM. MDM just wasn't designed to do this. So, I talked before about claims processing, Master data management tries to tell you, what do you know about the various data that you have? You have 3 different records for John Case, and based on those 3 records, you have a picture of what you think John Case looks like. But if a claim comes in and it's got a mistyped birth date that's different than what you know about John Case, or it's got a new address that you're not aware of yet for John Case, then your MDM technology can only work with the data you've given it, and the data you've given it is just different than the data coming in on this claim. So Verado's ability to use its validation process and provide the information that we have in our referential database to be able to take that claim record and say, yes, this is a current address. It may be different than the one you have. Here are some older addresses that probably do line up with the address you have. Our ability to do that validation and expand the number of attribute values that you're working with to connect that claim to your membership system is something that an MDM technology can't do, because we're bringing data to the table, not just algorithms. So MDM technologies bring algorithms to the table. You feed your data into it. We bring algorithms to the table, but we also have our own very rich, very comprehensive reference data that can be applied in different ways that you just can't do with an MDM system.
Thanks, John. We have another question for you.
Sure.
It goes, you might have touched on this already, but we'll just ask it anyways. Can Verado improve the quality of my member data? Specifically, we've struggled with removing SSN information and now adding it back in and having to report on it.
Yes. Yeah. So the short answer is yes. That's certainly a common scenario that we've seen. So I gave examples of misspelled birth dates and wrong addresses and things like that. Social Security number is a particularly tricky one for health insurance because people used to collect and store Social Security number pretty frequently until the government came in and said, you should stop doing that. That's a bad idea. And so people stopped collecting and storing SSN. They even went out of their way to purge SSN in some cases. And then lo and behold, the ACA comes along, and suddenly health insurance coverage has tax implications. And because it has tax implications, now you need to store Social Security number again. And so there's a lot of payer organizations that are feeling this pain of I don't have very accurate or complete Social Security number information, and that's starting to cause me problems. And so yes, one of the things we can do in that validation is either validate whether a Social Security number is correct for a person, or even be able to fill that in cases where it's missing, provided it's being used for legitimate purposes like tax filing purposes, anti-fraud purposes, things like that.
Great, thanks, John. Here's another one for you. How secure is Verado's cloud services?
No, that's a fair question. We get that one pretty often. The types of technologies that I talked about that are typically applied to these identity problems tend to be on-premise technologies, so people aren't as used to cloud technologies in this identity management or information management space. We have a very secure infrastructure. We have third-party certification for both HIPAA and PCI compliance. HIPAA, I'm sure everyone is familiar with in the healthcare industry. PCI stands for payment card industry. It's a set of security and privacy practices that are somewhat complementary to HIPAA. We are also in the midst of getting a high trust certification as well. So we have third-party attestations for our security. We have a number of healthcare clients who have gone through extensive risk assessment with us and feel comfortable using us. We have government organizations that have gone through those same risk assessments. So we have the third-party attestations of our security, and we also just have the fact that a lot of other customers have a comfort level of doing this. So I think the stigma of using cloud-based services for this kind of thing is certainly going away, and it helps when you can actually point to certified compliance with things like HIPAA and PCI and high trust.
Thanks. And last question we have is, what are your typical deployment durations? How long would it take for me to use your solution?
Yeah, that's another good question. So earlier I talked about, generically we talk in timelines of weeks rather than months or years. And that's, that is true. So that's a good expectation to have. Of course, it depends on what you're trying to do, right? If you're doing, some kind of diagnostic or pilot project, then we typically do those in a matter of weeks, which is really fast. Getting paperwork signed and getting the right person to sign something ends up taking longer than actually doing the delivery of the solution. If you're looking to if you're looking to take Verado services and plug them into some kind of existing business process that you've got, whether it's the claim example, HEDIS reporting, whatnot, really the process of plugging our technology in is, frankly, a matter of a couple weeks. We have web services, we have batch services, so it's really easy to plug those into your business process. It's probably more a matter of, what would your own project timelines look like if you were to take a claim processing process that you've already got and modify it to plug Verado in. The actual work of plumbing us in could literally be a week, but the larger project that you may want to go through is really going to depend on how your own processes work.
Great, and we're coming up to the end here. That's all the questions we had for today. Thank you so much, John, and for everyone out there, we will have the recording available online soon, and you should get a message about that. So thanks again. Have a nice day.